My name is Mario Wolf. I'm the director of a newly created body called the Right to Build Task Force, which is essentially a body that's been created by the National Customer Self-Build Association, which is called NACSPA, which is the trade body, consumer representative body of the customer self-build industry in the UK. And we've been created, I'm seconded from the Department for Communities and Local Government, as it was called now, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, to lead the task force, to really help both local authorities, community groups, landowners, developers, really understand what the right to build, which I'll come on to, and community and self-build housing is actually about and how it can be delivered. And we're in the process of creating a panel of experts, and we've got about 5 appointed so far, and we'll be going up to about 15, 20 to begin to work with community groups, local authorities, and others to really begin to understand what people need knowledge about in this sector and really help bring projects forward. And I'll come on to a bit more about how we work in a minute. But what I wanted to cover with you, and this is because I've only got 20 minutes, I'm going to just give you a very broad brush sector perspective from a sort of a national angle, and then try and translate a bit for you as to what it means for you on the ground, because I think it's very important you understand both the legislative context within which local authorities function. That's very important because you can have a more intellectual conversation and a more pointed conversation with local authorities. And I think the Community Land Trust Network and the Brighton Hove Network and others will be able to help to facilitate that conversation, because if you don't access land or you don't influence the policy position, you're not going to get anywhere, unless you've got land already. In which case, great, you can start to facilitate that. But you've got to start to have that conversation with policymakers about how they integrate projects within their overall aspiration. And that's a difficult and challenging job, but it's an essential one. Now, what let's just see if, yeah, it works. What I need to sort of also start with is we call ourselves the Customer Self-Build Association for 2 reasons. One is that it's a very broad church. It encompasses both custom build, which is something where you don't get your hands dirty in the development, essentially. You're working with a specialist developer, construction company, etc. And they provide most of the services for you, versus self-build, where you actually begin to engage in a hands-on way, either by project managing or doing some of the work yourself. And the second element is that it's very broad brush and it covers a whole series of different angles. So it's quite important, I think, to recognize the differences between the two. But it's also important to recognize it's not just about single homes. This is about potentially high-density solutions, high-density development. And that's what local authorities sometimes don't understand. You can build effectively with a developer or construction company exactly the same, better quality housing than a developer can. And they need to recognize that, and that's important. There's benefits for local authorities as well as communities, as well as landowners. It's important to recognize what some of those are. From a local authority perspective, it can help to speed up housing supply. And that's a very pertinent topic at the moment, because many developers are not building out at the pace that government and local authorities want. You will build if you get a piece of land. We know that. The question is how local authorities perceive you in the overall delivery process. It also has ability to identify, and I took one of the key words away in terms of eco or sustainability quality. It helps to bring forward much more dense development and higher quality development. And also, by commissioning, in many cases, someone to do it for you, you're also helping smaller builders and trades. And in many cases, there's fewer planning objections to your development because you're a local community building the homes for yourselves as opposed to a developer. And from a community's perspective, it really widens the choice. And I think this starts to touch on some of the key words that you mentioned. And it also can help with affordability, and I'll come on to that in a second. And also, it generally benefits the community much more widely in terms of promoting community cohesion, because you will stay in those properties for much longer than the average person would normally. And there's also opportunities for builders and landowners, and that's an also important aspect. And this helps to, when you make a pitch, you need to understand that there are aspects that actually developers and landowners will understand when you put it to them in terms of there is a different customer base that we're tapping into here. It can help speed up supply. It can improve the marketability of larger sites and widen the offer because the choice is different. And it can improve viability on development and help developer cash flow. From a small developer's perspective, working with you actually makes sense because the developer gets paid as they're building. They don't have to invest huge amounts of capital to build out and then sell their homes. By working with you, they get paid as they go through the process. So from a small builder's perspective, it really makes sense. And these are just some of the numbers in terms of the national picture, which we'll make these slides available so you can have a look at them separately because there's a lot of information on there. But it's important to recognize the sector, customer self-built housing sector, builds a substantial number of homes every year, and that's important. And those numbers are going up all the time, and you are part of that process. Most people don't want to buy a home from a volume builder because they don't build quality homes, and the choice isn't there. That's important. Many people who finish their build end up with a large equity in the property, which enables them to be in a better financial position when they sell their homes, as opposed to someone who's just buying it from the open market. And that's because you're not paying for a developer's profit. That developer's profit is going into your pockets as opposed to a developer. The average build cost, roughly £1,200 a square metre. So if you take an average, say, just under 100 square metre property, you're looking at £120,000. Now, that might be attractive, but that's excluding land. And that's where the real crux of the challenge comes. At the moment, the market, the average total build cost is £310,000, but that's because you're dealing with people who are at the moment fairly well capitalized in the market, and it's not really representative of what the groups are beginning to build. We haven't got that information at the moment. And most people build substantially larger properties than housing associations or local authorities or developers would build.
So
and there's
what's the 310,000, how many houses is that, sorry?
That's just average build cost of a project, so of a home, average. One home. That's the average, and that's built. That information is based on. There's a market report which has been published from the National Customer Self-Build Association on 500 properties. So that's a sample of 500 builds across the country on homes. It's not representative of what groups are building. That information isn't available because that's you could argue is out of reach of most people. So because the market at the moment is building, is looking backwards, has been building larger properties, it's not really representative of what the groups are building. We haven't seen any information on groups per se. And it's important to also recognize there's a lot of specialist customer self-build developers in the business already that can help develop properties. They know the business and they understand it. The question is, are they known to you? Can you engage with them? But understanding the legal and policy framework is very important from a group's perspective as well, because, as I said, it's important that you do engage with the local authorities about what their requirements are and how you can access land. Now, why we called the right to build. We called the Right to Build Task Force because there's a new legislation that local authorities now need to comply with. And it may be that most of you don't know what that is about. Do you know what the Right to Build means? What it is? No one. I'm not surprised at that because it hasn't been well publicized. It's a new duty on councils that was introduced in 2016, and that requires under the Self-Build and Custom House Building Act, that requires all local authorities in England, it's only applicable to England, to keep and publicise a register of individuals and groups of individuals, or it's called associations of individuals who want to build their own homes. That's the first element. The second element is they've got to have regard to that register when they dispose of land, when they plan, when they bring forward their housing strategies, and when they bring forward regeneration. But the hard edge of that legislation that came through in the Housing and Planning Act, which requires It's an absolute requirement, not a policy requirement, it's an absolute requirement for local authorities to bring forward enough service building plots, and that may be a whole range of different types, to meet the demand on the register on an annual basis. It's a cycle of 3 years, so every year the shutters come down, whoever's registered, those numbers then need to be provided for through building plots. And that's important. And there's a definition now in law about what custom and self-built housing is as a broad church. And that's important because that it needs to inform what local authorities do and how you engage with them. And there's some regulations which govern what that means in practice. Have you registered with your local authority on the self and custom built housing register?
Put your hand up if you have.
So about 10 people. Yes, of course.
I've emailed them.
Yeah.
To start actually the
Yeah.
process. There's some authorities they've got online registration and all that. But publicise, does that mean I will be on a public register? Because that
No.
has been my, when you say publicise.
It promotes the register. So tell people that the register exists. And the minimum requirement at the moment is that local authorities must have it on their website. In many cases, it's linked to the planning pages. It's hidden away. Local people don't know that it exists.
Your name isn't publicised on that.
It's
Well,
not.
It
No.
doesn't
It's
have anyone's personal information on it.
No.
It's just the register has to be publicly available.
yes. Some local authorities have made the register parts of the register public in terms of names, but they're not required to because it's protected information under the Data Protection Act. Yes.
It's just an observation, really. I mean, I registered, but I noticed that it was unnecessarily bureaucratic. So, first of all, it was quite opaque. You had to email a certain email address. It was listed on the website, but then you had to follow through with an email, which there was no form for. You just had to manually send an email. Then you get a canned response saying, please give us, 4 pages of documents proving every single individual is a Brighton and Hove resident, plus their DNA and blood samples and all the rest of it. It just seems like an unnecessarily burdensome.
I want Miro to give you more, so let's come back to that.
And it's a good point because there's lots of loopholes potentially, or if you can argue, faults or the blemishes in the way that legislation is constructed. Nevertheless, it exists, and that's important.
Persist.
Exists, persists, and It's also important, I think, it's not just the register, also through what's called the National Planning Policy Framework, which governs how the local authority brings forward its local plan, the city plan in the context of Brighton. They are required through the local plan to make specific reference and assess demand to custom and self-built housing. The question is Brighton and Hove currently doing that? Currently it's being revised, and there's much stronger measures now coming through than the revisions in the national framework. And very simply, the reason why both government and the sector is pushing so hard to actually enable more custom and self-built housing is a number of reasons. We've already mentioned the housing market is broken. There's a clear policy recognition nationally that it is, and that you need more choice in the market. You need to diversify the sector. We build the lowest number of custom and self-built housing in relation to most of our neighbours, and that's a fact. Less than 10% of all houses are currently self and custom built. If you look at Germany, 60%. So it's important, I think, that there's a lot of growth potential in the market. The question is how we get there. And part of the answer is by helping you get there to push up the numbers. Because we've lost, if you look at that graph at the bottom, a significant number of our local builders. Smaller builders have all declined. The market is centralized towards a much smaller number of bigger builders. And the key reasons for why people struggle to build their own homes is finding land, one, getting planning permission, securing finance, understanding what custom and self-built is really about, and then finding a reputable builder. But skills in the building trade is a challenge, finding good builders. So demand nationally, and we'll come on to local demand, is very strong. We know from Ipsos Mariupol survey, there's a lot of people. You're here today because you want to build your own home. Nationally, that picture is magnified hugely. And that's based on a survey. It's not actual numbers. It's a sample survey, but it's a repetitive number that keeps coming up over the last 5 years. And we've got over 33,000 people signed up on local registers nationally. But it's important, I think, you do, notwithstanding what you've said, it's important that you recognise that you should be on that local authority register. Most people do not know registers even exist. The position in Brighton and Hove, from my quick analysis, was that, and this is October 2017 figures, and this is, I think, a question for the CLT to ask the local authority. How many people are currently registered? My understanding was 42. That's based on the FOI request last year. I think those numbers are hugely underrepresented. If you look at other market information from the Custom Build Register, from Build Store, which is a finance provider, the largest in the country, 1,100. Plot search information from the Build Store, over 400. So the numbers of 42 is an underrepresentation. Nevertheless, that's what the local authority has to work with. And I understand from the FOI information about 6 groups were registered. I don't know if there's any more. You should all be on there. Every single group should be registered on that local authority's register, because that starts to build up pressure for the local authority to have to act. Now, how registers can help you access land, it's important that local authorities take account of the register, because they need to then bring forward planning permissions through various routes or release land to help to meet the demand. And they can use the registers to allocate land. In this particular case in Lewisham, the RUS project, Rural Urban Synthesis Society project, some of you might know about, and that's currently going through the system, where the local authority specifically sold a piece of land to a group, and that's coming forward through the process at the moment. And registers don't themselves give planning permission, but they are what's called a material consideration in the planning system, and that's an important consideration that you must bear in mind. They are relevant to a planning decision. The extent to which the local authority provides for custom and self-build housing. And they can be used to alert people, registers, to alert people on the register when the local authority gives consent. So if it gives consent for a development with custom and self-build an element, then it can let you know as a local authority that they've given permission, and therefore you can have a conversation with the land provider or the developer about what they're trying to bring forward, either as a group or individually. So my sort of conclusion in terms of the practical steps in terms of engaging with the local authority on the register aspect is important to register the interest. You need to engage with the local authority about how they are effectively discharging their duty, how they're meeting their duty. And partnership engagement with the local authority and landowners is important, because at the end of the day, the requirement stands, and the question is how it's going to be delivered. And don't forget, you've also got neighbourhood planning opportunities there. So I'll come back to neighbourhood planning in a minute, because that's a statutory provision which enables you as a community to work together to bring forward a project or a plan to help to bring forward housing. The local policy position, I thought I'd have a quick look to see what Brighton and Hove have currently got, and you might know a bit more about this than I. One is there is a housing strategy that Brighton has got, which does support local housing, and they have got some commitments to promote community housing within the housing strategy. Now, you might know a bit more about that. We can come on to that a little bit later, but there are some clear commitments that the local authority has given to help facilitate community housing. The question is how and what. In the planning sense, they have got the city plan. It's an adopted plan, as far as I'm aware, 2016, which commits to identifying potential housing sites in part 2 of the plan, which is currently being consulted on or going through the options process. So there's an urban fringe policy which broadly captures the commitment to look for opportunities for a broad range of different types of housing, including the type of housing that you want to build. The question is, where are those sites going to come from, and what is the local authority doing about it? And that's important.
And that's Nicola's role in our team.
Yeah,
really,
yeah. So that engagement, so you being clear, we'll come on to how you can play into this, because you being clear about your project and what you want to do, whether you've got finance and how you constitute it, makes a big difference in terms of the conversation that you can have with those land providers when the sites come forward. Because you are an important developer in the overall housing mix market in Brighton. And I just wanted to sort of give you a feel now in the last few minutes before I finish at the types of delivery models which are available to you in going through. Now, there's a broad number, and it depends on what type of organization that you form, who you are, and how you engage with the system. Broadly, and I mentioned service plots at the beginning, service plots is where the local authority initiates the development, either by releasing land, and it can be parcels, or even homes for self-finish purposes, where they build a shell and you finish it yourself, or housing association, where it's initiated through the council as a service building plot. The second one is where the service building plots come through either a community or a developer to bring forward opportunities for you to then buy land on the market to build your own homes. The second element is where groups are facilitated directly by the council. If you take Bristol, for example, Community Land Trust as an example, where they've created a community land trust to then bring forward projects on specific sites, where the councils are initiating that. And they've got money now available from government to actually help them do that, and increasingly so through the Community Housing Fund. To actually initiate projects. And the second one is where group projects work with others, and that's you, where you bring forward a project for development. Broadly, the custom self-built business models, as we call them, fall within those categories. In terms of service plots, fairly standard, but a whole different variety, where a large developer might set aside building plots for you, for someone to buy, either in a parcel for a group or individually for people to build their own homes. And the pressure we're certainly starting to apply to local authorities to say smaller plots means more affordable plots. Look for small plots, not necessarily large houses, to maximize return. The smaller you go, the more opportunities it provides for affordability. And you can include some of those building plots within developments like in Harlow, for example, building plots identified in Surrey, where developers provided custom-built plots within sites. The biggest one we've got coming through in the system at the moment is at Graven Hill, 1,900 homes that you probably know about, where the local authority is identifying a whole range of different custom and self-build opportunities on sites. Or a developer working with a smaller developer working with a large developer on a big site, which is providing self and custom-built finished options for individuals. So broadly, those are sort of service building plots type business model. But there are also opportunities to build at scale, and I mentioned density. You take the one in the left-hand corner at the top, where 12, Berlin example, for example, where 12 friends got together to buy a piece of land to then build with a contractor a terrace of homes, contracted together, financed together, built together. They didn't themselves do any work themselves, but worked with a developer. And many of the other projects that we've got here, those are all international projects, but we've got some coming through in the UK now, not quite at that density, but where you can build flats. There's no reason for why you can't do that. It depends on how big the group is and whether you've got a willing provider that is working with you. And it can work with, you mentioned rural areas, for example, urban extension. So the urban fringe in Brighton should be within remit. That's Graven Hill. That's the one that's coming forward at the moment. But you've got a whole range of different opportunities to bring forward custom and self-built housing. The question is, what type of project are you thinking of? How big is it? And where's the land going to come from? And you need a facilitative policy or a willing landowner to actually help work with you, and that's important. So that one at Graven Hill is it's phase 1A now at the moment, and they are selling a range of plots of different sizes, and they're also working with housing providers to bring it forward. Now that's attracting a huge amount of attention from local authorities about how you do it and how you can facilitate it. And that's what's happening. That's going to feature on Grand Designs fairly shortly next year, with Kevin MacLeod actually interviewing all those people that are building that first phase of homes. Small plots or a range of sizes of houses and different types. And then you've got custom build enabler models. I mentioned custom builders, where the custom builder will buy a site and then enable individuals to have a choice of what they select. Now, those aren't group developments in most cases. Those are individual plots being sold. So those individuals that might not be part of a group, they can think about whether, well, that's an option for us. The question is whether that provider is actually facilitated in the local area or has an option to purchase land. And the community-initiated project, this is the Lilac project in Leeds, for example, where they've identified a site with the city council and then brought forward a specific type of co-housing project. Now, there's a whole range of different types of constituted models that you can bring forward. Community land trust, co-housing, cooperative types of models which are available to you. And we'll come back to that at the end because it's important, I think, one, the community group does work as a group in order to have a much more business-orientated, business-focused conversation with the landowner about the project. And in affordable housing terms, it's important, I think, you recognize. So I think Brighton and Hove have got a policy. I think they ask for 40% affordable housing on all sites. So that's a policy requirement that falls on every every developer for a housing site. You can develop all of those yourself. They're all available to you. The question is the local authority recognizing it when it asks for affordable housing on a site? So community land trust, that's what you're about. You can do discount market sale where the individual house resale is capped in perpetuity, 80% of market value, etc. You can do shared ownership, and you can also do working with a housing provider, affordable rent and social rent models. And there's opportunities on the urban fringe, something called exception sites, which the National Planning Policy Framework allows you to build, where you buy the land at agricultural value effectively, to then build the homes as an exception site, which otherwise would not be available. And that's facilitated through the National Planning Policy Framework. And there are some really good projects, and I haven't got time to go into this, but I think perhaps in the follow-up session, one can go into and unpack some of these projects for you in terms of how they work. So there are some really good projects, like this is Broadhemston and Devon Community Land Trust project, 6 affordable homes built on the urban fringe, out on the edge of a village, at an affordable rate, where they worked with a small contractor. Exception site in policy in Shropshire, and this is important to start influencing what the local authority is thinking in terms of what it facilitates through its local plan to help you bring forward your land opportunities, where single exception sites are permitted within the urban fringe or in the countryside. Yes, the resale is capped in perpetuity. You can't sell it at full market value, and there's restrictions on the size. Nevertheless, it provides an opportunity for you to find a piece of land which otherwise would not get permission. And there's some really good projects coming forward in the southwest, Bristol CLT, where they've identified projects, sites there, with in some cases brownfield sites, to bring forward opportunities for group developments. And there's a lot of information around these, and I think one thing you could do is actually make some of that available going forward, so people know what good looks like. And we've got some people here who are looking at older people's housing, very hot topic on the national policy agenda. Some local authorities are really actively looking to facilitate that. This particular project in Barnet hit the headlines on the BBC towards the end of last year. They've had over 500 inquiries nationally about how their project worked, working with, in this particular case, with Hanover Housing Association on a school site, acquired with the Housing Association as the developer, effectively, and then working with an architect and a contractor to bring that forward. I'm running out of time. Yeah.
I was just going to say, we're okay till 5 past. But
yeah.
If I might be. Do people want Mario to carry on for another few minutes, or do you want to ask? Has anyone got a burning question, clarification? Carry on, please.
I'll finish off. Yeah, and Marmalade Lane, for example, in Cambridge, where they've identified a brownfield site, local authority site, to bring forward a co-housing project for local people. Again, the issue there was, did the planners really understand what it is you wanted, what the community wanted, how what was the outcome, what does the business model look like, and that's important. And that's one of the lessons I think we come back to at the end is, what is your business plan, what is your vision, and you need to be clear about who's going to help to facilitate this project with you, because you're on your own. If you're on your own, you're not going to do it. You do need advisors and support.
The developer, Johnny Anstead, We Are Town, is part of our board, CLT board, so it's really helpful.
Good project, and one of our advisors on the task force, Adam Broadway, from Instinctively Green, who's led that project, enabled it, is also on our panel, and could be available to provide further advice. And also housing association-led projects. There are housing associations which do it. So it's important, I think, one canvasses the housing association that are currently active within Brighton and Hove. And I think it was Hayes, did you say, Richard, that's currently operating here, the local authorities, the one. What's the local authorities' preferred housing association partner? Hyde. So the question is, are they sympathetic to enabling custom and self-built housing? What type of models, etc.? Is it affordable rent, or is it shared ownership, etc.? And we could go on identifying a number of different projects, but I think it's important to recognize you can do it in a whole variety of different ways. And there's lots of detail behind how these individual projects worked in practice. And also there's some really good examples coming through of where individuals are not working with a housing association. They actually, they're buying, in this particular case, this was also on the BBC, where in London a set of owners collectively bought up housing stock from the local authority and then redeveloped it, formed a private company, effectively, redeveloped it and brought in, built a number of additional flats, cut off a bit here, built a number of additional flats to finance the build at the end of it. Very entrepreneurial approach and very successful. But it's an opportunity, I think, you need to think about. Can we collectively actually buy up a property and then redevelop it for our own purposes? And I mentioned neighbourhood planning because that's important too, particularly maybe in the urban fringe. Are there any neighbourhood groups that are currently there, parishes or neighbourhood associations that are currently bringing forward neighbourhood plans? Because they are a good facilitator. The status of a neighbourhood plan is on par with the local authority's local plan. And you can identify, in Petersfield, for example, and one of our facilitators on the panel led this plan, you can identify parcels within that neighbourhood plan for custom and self-build only. That's important as a leverage to actually identify land opportunities. And some quite sizable ones too. Now, some local authorities will say, we can't allocate land for self-build. They're wrong. You can, because they've got a legislative requirement to make provision for custom and self-built housing, so they can do it. And you can, if we are available to, if you want to call us in to provide some further advice, Andrea, we can start to pick out some models which actually you can have a conversation with the local authority about what you can do on bigger sites, because there's some really good examples nationally, internationally, about how sites can be split up and parcels sold to individual groups. Market value, at the end of the day, in many cases. It's cross-subsidized from higher-end products, from higher-end solutions, but in many cases it's market value, but it's a fixed price where you get an opportunity to bid for that piece of land. The moment you're being outbid on sites, or they're too expensive, you can't access them. And speeding up delivery, for example, in Delft, where the local authority has identified specifically, and this is what we need to get our UK authorities to do, and there's a conversation to be had with Brighton when larger sites come forward. Some of those parcels can be split up and sold individually to you. Why aren't they doing it? The question is, is there just one big developer and they're going to maximize profit? They're going to put in affordable housing, and at the end of the day, they might overbid for the land and then therefore whittle down the affordable housing provision that they're required to do. Or could they split up the site and offer it in different ways? And that's an important sort of policy solution that one could recognize. Don't discount the opportunities for, and we've got an advisor on our panel, a task force panel as well, the opportunity for what's called self-refurbishment opportunity. Now, these are service plots within buildings where school sites or public buildings or commercial buildings could be made available for you to actually fit out, working with a contractor or your trades. And it's about identifying what those options might be to then bring forward your own accommodation in different ways. It doesn't have to be a detached home on a big site. It can be within existing buildings. And I brought a book, and I'll leave it with you. It's one particular example where they've worked with a housing association to instead of redeveloping an old block of housing association flats, make those flats available to the community. Let the community individually buy those flats and bring their trades in to refurb them. And you come up with some really good examples of a redevelopment, doing it that way, with a house, whether you've got a willing housing association or an existing landlord that's willing to engage with a collective of individuals. Very quickly, how we work, just to finish off there, what we can do is we can provide advice. The way we work is we ask, maybe it's through the Community Land Trust network, ask for an expression of interest. What sort of advice do you need to help facilitate perhaps some of the groups in the room? We will have an initial conversation with you as to what we do, what we can help with. We'll then put forward a little proposal on the brief to help on specifics, and then we'll appoint one or two of our experts to actually provide advice going forward, and then we'll undertake the work. And there's a whole range of different things that we can advise on. These are some a selection of different elements, right from assessing demand for larger sites, because developers and landowners will know what's the level of demand. That's why you need to register with your local authority, finding delivery partners, finance opportunities, viability considerations. Those are available, and we can plug in certain experts to provide support. So we're here to help. It's important, I think, you recognize that, but at the same time, I think you need to be clear. What's your vision? Have you got a business plan? What's your finance availability? Those are essential ingredients to your success. And I would also say a facilitator. In many cases, architects. The big successful models we've seen abroad have all got a facilitator, project manager. In many cases, it's architects who are actually involved in the project, in some cases live there too, or maybe a project manager. You need professional advice because you've got to act like a developer in a sense. And working as a collective is a much stronger position to be in rather than an individual. If you're on your own, it's much more challenging. I would plug myself into a group and act as a collective. 10, 20 people, I think is probably, for us, feels right. I've seen projects of 400, but we're not there at that stage. We need to create the infrastructure to help you to access the right solutions. But I would say that, and I come back to, understand the way the local authority has to act. The question is how they act and how you engage with them. And I think the CLT for Brighton and Hove can help you with that collectively, because you've got a strong representation, and there may be more groups in the area to actually say, well, how are we going to accommodate ourselves? What are you doing to facilitate this?
Great, thank you.
Has it got? And we are collectively self-building our homes here in Brighton this year, quite soon. I push the arrow. And
hi, I'm Raphael.
so yeah.
I like it.
So for those of you that don't know, what is a co-op? So basically what we're going to do is give a brief explanation of our project, because it's going to be possible for us to sort of talk about each person's one. So we thought we'd give you an example of what we're doing, and then we can answer questions about that after. So for those of you that don't know, a housing cooperative is not bricks and mortar. It's the group of people and the means they use to collectively control and manage their housing. So as you've heard, there are lots of different ways you can kind of organise your group. We chose a co-op for pragmatic reasons, because it allowed us to behave in a certain way we couldn't as individuals. We are zero equity, so none of us has a financial stake in the co-op other than £1, so no money goes in, and if you leave, no money goes out. And what is community self-build? Different from individual self-build, because working in a group, well, you've heard it all already. What that allows you to do is slightly different than what you can do on your own, and is supported financially and policy as well. We, like every other community-led housing project, you'll see this acronym a lot. There's a whole world of acronyms that you're going to have to get used to. These land, people, money and support, and we have found all of those in this room. So, our story. Initially, we were two families that met over a garden wall. We're both in private rented accommodation, working in the building trade, self-employed, building other people's homes, no chance of buying a home in Brighton, and certainly no chance of being housed by the local authority. So kind of stuck, as people have said, in that kind of private rented accommodation trap. And we wanted to find our way out of that. What can we do? You know, we basically either we move somewhere else or we find another way. And we came across a local group called Chibber and got into the kind of co-op thing there. And we wanted to, rather than join a group, we wanted to start our own because we wanted to be able to develop our own identity and work particularly as we were low income families with young children. That was our sort of initial idea. And we also wanted to be, our idea initially was for about sort of 10 homes. But, so we registered as a co-op in 2014. As I say, we planned building for families. We planned to be bigger. We wanted to build a sort of community of initially live-work units because everyone that was in the co-op, as well as being sort of a builder or whatever, was also a musician or a photographer or an artist or whatever. So we would like the idea of building a community where we could kind of live and work together. These are some of our members, current and one ex. So like I say, initially we thought of building about 10 homes, but we ended up going to a meeting with Brighton Hove City Council as part of Chibber, and we found out about this infill site. So it's a really small site that had been earmarked for a potential co-op pilot scheme. And we were just like, well, we're only two families at this point, so let's just go for it. And we're lucky enough Andrea came on board, so she's someone, Range, you can pick about our project as well, as project manager. Like you said, really helpful having a project manager. So what we needed to do then was get a business case together. We needed to present ourselves as a viable concern. And if you look at some of the stuff we came up with, and the architect brilliantly designed for us, our planning application looked like that of a large developer. It had to be completely very robust, very clear, and not. I mean, some of them you can actually look at planning applications on the planning portal, and some of them are literally back of an envelope, scribbled on some, but we had to behave. We had to demonstrate that we weren't just dreamers that didn't know what we were doing. We had to be really. Our finances, our plans, everything had to be robust, had to be costed, 40-year spreadsheet, etc. And the council were really helpful. They really helped us with that actually, which we can, if anyone wants to know how, I can tell you. So our first phase, it's a pilot scheme for us and for the council. So what we're trying to do is develop high quality sustainable homes, a model that we can then roll out, because this is only for 2 homes on the first site, but obviously we've got, as we said, we've got 10 members. We want to build for our membership, expand our membership and keep building up to the point where we've had enough, we're all too tired, or we haven't got any more members or whatever.
Well, it's also to make it sustainable as an entity, isn't it? That you've had to grow in a way. So
And also with the method that we're using, the modular method, we want to do something that, so next time, I mean this time has taken 4 years, 4 years this year, but the idea is that next time it's going to be a lot quicker. Not just for us, for other groups, but by coming up with a system, both building system and a way of working, that can be just with small changes rolled out. And this is, we're sharing all of this as co-ops do with anyone that's interested. This is the site, as I said, it's not an easy one, which is why a developer wasn't potentially interested in it, other than us. It's got a narrow drive coming in here. When we got there, it's not serviced, as you can see. It's like, brambles up to here, full of rubbish, 20 years of people chucking crap over their fences into it. But it's a site, and it's there, and it's ours, and it's there. So it was garages, these were the garages along the side. So there's basically nothing there. There's a couple of knackered old lampposts. There's electricity that runs through there, but there's no water, there's a runoff. So we've got to do everything, basically.
I wonder if it's just worth saying while we're on that slide that, about the other side of this, the sort of planning, building a house is one thing, but getting through all of the legislative problems is a major exercise. And so a site like this is absolutely surrounded by people who have lived there for a long time and aren't that keen on the idea of somebody living at the end of their garden. And it's literally, I mean, it looks quite big there, but they're like literally a couple of metres away. And on top of that, the site was completely inaccessible. We couldn't even access the keys to get to the gate without a huge amount of trouble. So just the kind of whole exercise of putting together a planning application from sort of our side was a very technical and complicated exercise. It's completely separate from the kind of the issues of trying to raise the money and so on. And so it's been an amazing journey, really. So it gets to the point we finally, now the site's clear and we've got better access, and we've finally been able to make a proper survey of the site. And and it's like, please, let's hope the houses actually fit, So, but that's the kind of thing that you have to kind of bear in mind right at the beginning, that these, to get these kind of affordable, kind of awkward little sites. You have to really...
Well, with the party wall as well, right?
Yeah,
So
wall,
potentially we've got to have party wall agreements with all of these houses. Yeah, and each one of those is about 750 quid, isn't it?
Well, assuming that it's easy.
Yeah. So it's yeah. So we're sort of picking on this one basically. So we want to.
Anyway, sorry, stop. This was about 3 years ago.
That was our first site visit actually. I've got some other ones of what it looks like now. So yeah, where are we now? 2 years negotiation and preparation. Last year, the New Homes Neighbourhoods Committee voted unanimously to lease us the land for 99 years, because that wasn't guaranteed. Even though it had been earmarked for a pilot scheme, we still had to prove that it would work, which was 2 years of toing and froing and changing the business plan. We also had a public consultation, which came to, didn't we? The council helped us organise that. That was great. We had a few people come along who were not quite so sure about what we wanted to do, but we kind of had a chat with them and put their mind at rest that we weren't going to build a massive tower block at the bottom of their garden. They liked the idea that we were a community, that we were families, that we weren't doing it for profit, that we were going to live there, that we wanted to make our own homes. They actually, people liked that.
Definitely. I mean, what you were saying, that I think if it was developers, council developers putting as much density in there as possible, it would be a different story, but they've actually grown to really like it. They even bought us a cup of tea. It took them 4 years. But
Yeah, but importantly, it was from the person who was the most resistant and the most vocal. And she is now here, handed us a cup of coffee over the fence when we were there on a recent site visit. So it has come round. But there was normal fears, they just wanted to know who we are, what we were going to do, basically. But it was a good exercise, and that's us doing that. So yeah, we've got a model there, which is great. Public consultation. We also have. Is that showing that one? Oh, we've done some clearance, so you can see we kind of started hacking away at the jungle and chopping things back. We're going to keep all of the sort of surrounding trees and things that we can, but obviously they had to be cut back so we could get around the site so we can measure it in the first place. How are we paying for it? Well, we are 80% mortgage from the College Building Society, and loan stock, which some of you know about, some of you don't. I think these slides are going to be available to everyone after, is that right? Yeah. So you'll be able to go back on this, and as Ed mentioned, we have recently got a grant as well, which is really helping us with professional fees, which are considerable actually. Not just the party wall, but various other things. From the Brighton Hove Community Land Trust. Yeah, so why would you do it? I mean, for all the reasons that we've talked about already. You can pool your resources and your capital, and you are stronger together. It is a long journey, it is exhausting, and you get to support each other through it. You can be involved in the whole process, which is what's really exciting. From the design of the homes, looking at the site, what can we do? We created a list of our sort of, a dream list really, for our architect's brief was kind of a mixture of kind of practical things, of whether we wanted shared space and private space, and the sort of random things like we wanted to be a cabin in the woods, we wanted to be this, we wanted to be that. And kind of going through that process of matching your wants and your needs and your aspirations with your kind of wallet and the site and being realistic with costs and things, and also what your group can do. I mean, the thing is, we all working in the building industry, that sort of change. So we are going to be we're project managing it. We are bringing in contractors to do the majority of it. We're going to do some of the finishing ourselves. We've done some of the site clearance. So as a group, we're doing the actual physical bit to what we can do, matching our skill set, you know, which is something is good to know for your own group as well.
I think that's an important, it's a part, but I think where we came right at the beginning was trying to figure out what self-build meant. Again, what you were saying is, I think at the beginning it was really self-build. It was going to be getting shovels and digging foundations, and it's been a process of figuring out actually to what extent would self-build destroy the project. You know, because if your aspirations are too big, it will just never happen. It's like money. You know, you have to be realistic, and so it's, you know, at the end, self-build is probably coordinating all of this stuff, and at the end of the day, helping to sort of, you know, finish off the paintwork and stuff, you know, to some degree, without sort of belittling it. But, you know, that's really important, because if you're sitting there with your family thinking, yeah, we're going to build our homes, but as a result it never happens, then you might as well not start, you know. So,
also, it's not just about your hands getting dirty on site. There's the 10,000 emails, there's the meetings, there's all the other stuff that goes into it. You know, that's what you do together as well. That's part of the self-build. And then it's changed as when we looked at the site to what we could do. You know, we initially thought we'd have like Walter Seagull homes, you know, the really totally timber frame ones that you do yourself, off the shelf things, but that wasn't suited at all for the site. So it's kind of evolved as we went along, hasn't it? Trying to find a way to match.
I think so. It comes back to this thing I was saying earlier about the aspiration, that you could have just bought 3 by 2 from Travis Perkins and knocked something together. In theory, I don't know if you could have done that actually from a planning perspective or not, but actually it's an opportunity from the beginning. Everybody could see the opportunity to do something that was much more aspirational and exciting. And so one of the ways I got involved in this at the beginning was by presenting to Martyn that the self-build might be a modular system that has someone delivers it on the back of a lorry and it has a roof and windows, and you can just self-build the tiles in a bathroom or something. Perhaps that feels more manageable. And I think that was our sort of selling point at the beginning when we were pitching for the job. At the beginning, we wanted to use some really cool sort of structural timber systems, and they just got factored out through cost and complication and access. And 3 years later, they've been factored back in again. But it's been a huge journey. I think that's what you were talking about.
That's part of that's exactly what you were talking about. That's when we were doing it. Yeah. So this is the pitch when we sat down and discussed it, wasn't it? The different design options, basically.
I know there was that kind of different.
So this is the small model of the site. And then what the guys did was they made like little paper models of the different designs that we could drop in and see what they look like on site, as well as giving sort of pictures of what they could look like. It was really, really useful.
It was a lot to do with the dynamic between the families. There were the other family has now sort of split off and someone else has joined, but it was about sort of living as a community. Sort of helped was the other factor that from my angle, like thinking, well, how do you live together without kind of getting on top of each other, and but then without becoming 2 separate houses? And it's really interesting. I mean, it's discussions about I want my window frames to be brown and I want mine to be kind of silver or something like that. It comes down to that, But at the same time, as the architect, you're thinking, it'd be so nice if it was kind of unified.
And I think also we wanted to have some private space, but we also wanted to have some communal space as well. And the good thing about the important thing about the design was how can you do that on such a small site? How can you have that, a bit of privacy and some public space where we can hang out together, where the kids can play together as well. So it was really important, and the design was a very important part of it, which leads us on to this. So I think as far as advice goes, I think once you've got your group together, then to start working on a brief is a really good thing to do, because it helps you pull all of these ideas together within your group. What sort of spaces, like I said, what style, and having a sort of wish list, and also what you don't want as well as what you do is quite important, and a realistic appraisal of your abilities and your finances. So all of our loans and everything, all repaid by our rent, basically. So it's that's how we pay everything back. So you need to sort of work that out as well, because if you don't want to pay any rent or hardly any rent, then what you can borrow is going to be considerably reduced. But then sort of working out the affordability of it Engage an architect as early as possible, I think, is a really good idea. As soon as you've got that brief, because that will really help you, again, match your ideas, your wants, your needs and your aspirations to your site, skills and your wallet, all things that are really important. Yeah, and the clearer it is, the faster it's going to be to move on, so not to waste too much time. These are our plans.
You know, I think something about that is when I met Martyn to start with, I think if they hadn't have done this brief, we probably wouldn't have taken it so seriously, because obviously we had to, you know, take them on a wish to some extent at the beginning, because, you know, the nature of the funding. And it was really helpful that it was, you know, it felt like you were taking on a serious project.
Also, what we did was we got that brief together and then we approached 3 different architects, so ones that we had heard about, had recommended to us, and ones that we knew that had worked with self-build and what was Seagull method before. We looked at what they came back with, and then we looked at the different things, so the design, the cost obviously, but we needed an architectural practice that was willing to work at risk with us at the time because we had no money. So the deal is that the architects would work with you up to a certain point, and then once it gets to a stage where you could draw down some funding, then they would get paid. That's obviously going to be changed a bit now with money that's available through the partnership, because you can, I think you can apply for money for that, can't you? Whereas we couldn't do that at the time, so we had to find an architect that was kind of to take a punt on us. So like you said, it helped that we were together, right?
So then you investigated the loan stock before you went to the architect. What order did things happen?
The loan stock came up, we started the process of looking for loan stock, but the thing is we didn't really want to get into debt because we weren't sure either that it was going to happen. You know, and we would have been saddled then with well, not saddled, but we would have a debt that we weren't able to repay because we had no money coming in, because it's going to come from renting the properties, right? So we kind of started to gather loan stock pledges.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of way that it works with loan stock. If you don't know that, first you kind of contact co-ops and they will say, yeah, we would lend you this much over this period of time at this rate of interest. And that's a pledge, and then that's ready to draw down when you need it, basically.
You have to send them your business case
That's
and your
right,
financial
yeah.
model. You have to have a lot worked out. It's like selling your project to the other co-ops to say we're viable and we're robust.
And we're happy to share what we did with anyone that's interested in looking at it. You know, all of part of the whole process is because we've had so much help from different people within the co-op movement, from Brighton, that all of our stuff is open source, basically. If you want to read it, some of it is more interesting.
Sorry, just a question. So this is what you gave to your architect?
No, this is what they drew.
This was the end of quite a long process, like 2 years of going through. You know, it started off like this, and then it got rationalised design-wise, just as any development would do, and it was an amazing process.
And planning as well, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Planning would accept certain things externally. There are obviously restrictions on height and things like that, but we wanted about 100 square metres, 3 bedrooms each home. You know. They went up.
Little garden, bit of open space,
exactly. And that's what it worked out at.
So you've also decided that you want only 2 homes there, basically?
Yeah. Initially, because we were only 2 families. So we
And the height restriction.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a very small,
Yeah.
there's a limit to what you can fit on that side.
We just got away with a pop-up, didn't we? Right, you could probably...
Yeah, well, I mean, you can probably see it's incredible. I mean, there's not much space left on the site, basically.
This is the communal garden, yeah.
I don't know, it was a little
Private,
the kind of challenge you face is that Brighton and Hove, just as we were at the point, some money had come through and we were ready to move forward, the designs were sort of coming together. We were ready to get some advice from the council because what we were putting there was quite big for the site, you know, from a normal planning perspective. It really, to be honest, it's amazing it got through. I mean, it's contravened planning policy, I would say.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And unfortunately, Brighton suddenly decided to withdraw its pre-planning advice facility, which is something these days you have to pay for. You know, I'm sure you can't just phone up a planning officer anymore. You have to pay for advice, and if you're lucky, it might be good advice. But they actually, I don't quite know how it happened, but they allowed us to have an exceptional case to submit it for pre-planning advice, and the head of planning had a look at it, and really so the whole process has been, I think it's been sort of driven by everybody's sort of view that it's worthwhile, isn't it? You know, somehow. And so I don't know, I think that's something that would apply to other projects in the same way, that, you know, you've got a site that is a problem, you can either give it back to the people that had their gardens chopped off at the beginning to make the garages, or turn it back into garages or keep it locked up. But to be able to, the opportunity to turn it into some kind of home is obviously going to involve a little bit of sort of meandering around the rules. So and I think that's true across these sites, across the country. I mean, in every council in the country, they're identifying garage sites.
Yeah, well, in infill sites are every kind, aren't they? Yeah, totally. Did you want to ask?
I was just going to say, overlooking is obviously an issue that you had to deal with. How did you that's one of the key considerations in planning terms, isn't it? The extent to which the neighbouring properties overlook your space and you can overlook their space. Is it because you have the exterior windows facing the gardens, or are they sort of screening?
It's just the way we just worked it out around distances to neighbours,
Okay.
so on the
Just
sort of
privacy by distance.
17, 19 metres.
Also, the site is slightly lower than the
Right.
gardens around
Right.
it. You can see, so on this, that is the level of their garden. So that's kind of 2/3 of the way up our window. So they'd have to come right to the end to
I don't
look
know if
in.
you can see the site, actually the back of the site, so that's the drive up there, there's the houses, that's one house and that's
Basically,
the
it's a whole floor lower, isn't it?
Yeah, more or less.
Around it.
Yeah,
2
more or
metres
less.
lower up here, so
Yeah.
it meant that actually the neighbours are sort of, their back gardens are kind of like around here, so obviously we weren't allowed to have big windows and balconies on here, but this window here is, it's a good 20
So
metres.
there you can see, yeah. But I mean, that's why they're actually oriented that way, isn't it? Where we thought initially to go that way, but we couldn't because of exactly that restriction.
Well, I think the reason why I ask is because I think this, for me, that's always a key question. Is you might have an aspiration to build, you know, a grand design type of property, even though it's quite affordable. But you need to make sure that it's compatible with, it fits into the planning context, and you might have to make significant compromises in that. You need to be able to,
Well, that's why I think.
and that's why you need a support,
absolutely.
a manager
As early as
or
possible,
an
yeah.
architect on board. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think it's really, I mean, it's so specialist. I mean, it might just as a bit of completely different from the community thing is what I do every day in my business. So I get planning permission for people's whatever extensions, little houses, changing garage into a living space, and the rules are insane. You need to know your way around the rules, and they're not intuitive, the rules. And often what you have to do is break things up into different pieces, so bits that are permitted, bits that are kind of part of this application, bits that are part of this application. And there's no, you couldn't sort of read a book and go, okay, now I understand it, I'll go off and do it. It's just learning by trial and error. And you know, I've done hundreds of applications, and that's how we solve, that's how we approach things like, where can we get a second story on this building, you know? At the beginning it was much bigger, let's say.
So this is exactly what we're saying here. It starts early. You know, the architectural role is more extensive in this kind of project than it would be in a normal one. It's a long-term relationship. It's important that they get community-led housing, I think, and that they get working with a group that is going to be slightly different on their part as well, because there's a lot more kind of interaction, right, with that group. They're not just going to be able to scurry off and just do stuff, because then you might say we don't like it, which was really great. All architects are different. We just from the 3 we had, the responses to the site and our brief were completely different. You know, so it's not like it's a standard thing. I think it's really important to think of it as a long-term relationship. And obviously then you've got the benefits that a skilled professional does bring to your project. So am I just standing in your way?
Thank you.
So yeah, what method, on-site, off-site, traditional, modular? We looked at all of these through the process. Walter Seagull, brick and block, structurally integrated panels, SIP, straw bale, lightweight steel, timber frame, and the one we eventually settled on, which is cross-laminated timber, which allows us to build our wooden houses with a modular system. That doesn't involve this. This is a Walter Seagull barn-raising style thing. Group's not big enough, site's not right. But we ended up with a wooden house anyway. We'll be really quick. This is some examples of those. These are like, so there we are. This is SIPs, which is structurally integrated panel. That's cross-laminated timber, which is that one there. That's straw bale being rendered there. That's timber frame, brick and block, and lightweight steel frame. So you can't really, you know, it doesn't really matter. It's sort of what you want, really. it matters to us for ecological reasons.
I know we sort of run out of time, I know,
Yeah.
but I think it's really worth saying that if you were just doing a project at home, extending your house or something like that, and you said to the, you went through the process and you thought, I'm going to build a straw-baled building or something because you've seen a cool example of it and that's what you want to do and it's eco or something. I can virtually guarantee that by the end of the decision-making process, your building will be made out of aircrete blocks. And all of those things will have been sucked out of the project because that's the way it's structured. Everybody will advise you this is the most affordable, this is the most sensible, this is the most conventional, and so on. And I really think that this way of doing things, this sphere, puts you in a position where you can say, no, I'm not going to make it out of aircrete blocks, I'm going to keep persisting and I'm going to make it out of straw bales. And the impossible becomes possible. I mean, literally, I've worked on probably 400, 500 projects in the last 4 years, and small projects from tiny planning issues to, to full-blown built things. And every single one has ended up going into the conventional because of cost and because of advice from the builders, so building regs. And I think it's so exciting that we've gone through these kind of steel frame systems, timber frame, SIPS panel, CLT, and we've managed to kind of stave off all of the voice of reason to just turn it into another good old-fashioned brick house.
Well, that's why the relationship was important, because obviously that's been a process of kind of toing and froing, and having an architect that was willing to stay the distance as much as we were is a really important thing. So getting project I think we're going to come to an end. So we've sort of covered some of this. We can cover some of this afternoon. There are things that you can do, different stages that you're at, recommendations. Again, this is going to be shared. Running the organisation is a really important decisions you need to make there. I think that the good thing is that you need to get on the same page, essentially, and then you can start working on that page collectively. But getting on that page is really important, because then you've got something at the centre that you can all work on, that you can share, that all of the professionals that you work with, you're all working what's in the centre rather than them being sort of the ideas that people have inside them. It's getting it all out, getting it in the middle, like you say, this is much money we've got, this is what we want, these are the skills that we have, these are who we are, this is how many, all of that. And then it can all start being moulded centrally. And obviously working out, I mean, that sort of happens anyway, people will come and go from the group. So the results, they're all different. These are 4 examples. They all happen to have wood on them, like ours is. 2 in Brighton. Oh no, sorry, there's Brighton, Leeds and Bristol. It's as unique as your group, essentially. There's no one way for any of you to do it, and there's no one result. But we can help you along the way.
Right, any questions? We've got literally about 2 or 3 minutes if people want a 15-minute break for lunch. Can I just have a straw 15 minutes? Has everybody got lunch and okay with that? Yeah.
I've got a question.
Sorry, I'm just going to, because I'm just going to share the questions out. So someone who hasn't asked a question so far.
I just had a question about your financial model. So you're renting from a co-op that you're part of? Sorry, there you are.
We're releasing the land from the council, and we are going to be the tenants and the landlords. That's how the co-op works, essentially.
Okay, yeah.
So we kind of collectively build it, and then we collectively own it, and our members are housed within it. So we are both the landlords and the tenants.
And you created the co-op?
Yeah, and we created the co-op.
But the idea is bigger than just those 2 in the longer term.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, totally.
What are the costs of leasing the land from the council? Are there costs? How does it work?
£500 a year for the first 20 years. It's a 99-year lease. It's going to be revised after the first 20 years. We went through a little bit of negotiation about how that's going to be pegged to affordable housing. So hopefully, they won't turn around. We've got an agreement that they won't turn around and suddenly start charging us thousands of pounds for the lease.
Can I ask about the process of getting the land from the council and then getting the architect? Did you make the relationship with the council first as a group, and then they suggested the land, and then you got the architect? Is that
Yeah, that was the way it worked.
so it's really about creating that really good relationship with the council first?
Well, no, that's not strictly true. We didn't make a really good relationship with council. We were in a meeting as part of, because Martyn's been part of the kind of local movement, and we were in a meeting where someone happened to say, we've got this bit of land and we decided we're not going to do what we're going to do with all the other bits of land. And me and Martyn were there, and Martyn just popped his hand up and said, I'm sure we could do something with that. It was really as serendipitous as that.
Right, yeah.
And I know it shouldn't be like that, but that's how it was 3-4 years ago.
But I think that's really
And they had this RIB architectural competition for these other small infill sites other than this one. So that one was serendipity for Bunker, but we are trying to work with the council to have a proper pathway for land like that coming up, and we, with Peter and the rest of the CLT, we're really working hard to develop a kind of much fairer process than us just having to be in a meeting.
And they also, just to add there's also an instrument called brownfield registers, which now every local authority has to have. Brighton and Hove will have one.
And
Nicholas got ours.
Yeah.
So they will. The question is
They
what
have
type of land is identified on that, when they, new land should be coming onto that, and so it's important to bring some land to the council and say this should be identified.
Yeah, that's true. They have a duty to update it.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff on there is a bit strange, but there is also some good nuggets of stuff on there as well. It's just quite difficult to plough your way through it and make sense of it, but that's what I'm doing. So everyone else doesn't have to do that.
Brownfield register.
In relation to going back to the relationship with the council, that's something that developed over the time, I think, and that's because that's part of what the pilot scheme was. They wanted to see how community-led groups work because they hadn't done it for so long.
Yeah. Erica?
You're going to pay rent.
Yes.
How are you deciding how much rent to pay?
It's basically called a cost rent.
Right.
So we take into consideration the cost of our paying back our debt, maintenance, extraordinary maintenance fund, just in case anything horrible goes wrong. We have to cover voids. So basically we add together all of those and then we divide it up, and that's how we work out how much.
Maybe explain what voids are.
Voids are when the houses are empty.
What's the end of that?
At the moment it's £750 a month. £750 a month for 3-bedroom property.
Which is probably, less than 50% of what you pay for 3-bedroom property, modern 3-bedroom property in Brighton.
Obviously there will be room to manoeuvre on that as we start paying back our debt, but we probably won't go down.
I'm sorry, I've got a question. Yeah.
Sorry, you might have mentioned it, and I just didn't hear it. Did you have to invest any money?
No, £1, but that's not a real pound.
Yeah.
One more, and then I think we should break for lunch. But we're all going to come back together again, and we're going to talk about what we do next to help self-build move forward in Brighton with all of you. So, and everyone's going to be part of that. So we'll get to ask many more questions. So, just one more.
I was interested in what you said about taking Martyn and his group more seriously when it actually came to the presentation to you. What had you needed to take their proposal kind of seriously at the time?
Well, they had just prepared themselves and done their homework, and they'd done this. I think this serendipity about this project, that's why I think we're ending up, I'm just hitching the ride really on this. Martyn's been through this incredible journey.
So they had the site, and they had a project manager, they had their structure.
Yeah, they had an opportunity, so they created a structure to sort of fulfill that opportunity.
Okay.
They got allocated, I think they kind of won a little kind of bidding to get this piece of land. So they were, and I knew about this thing because I'd been looking at the RIBA Journal thinking, we should join this competition to get some houses in Brighton. So obviously, when I met Martyn and they'd set up this thing and they had a proper brief and they knew all the details about the funding and obviously it was totally plausible and it was a real project because I was reading about these sort of connected projects in the media.
How we did it is we just looked up what is an architect's brief on Google and they just did it.
It wasn't that simple. They'd made it really personal. So it was like, we want it to be like this and it could be like that.
Yeah.
And so it was something to respond to. Because I had to pitch it to my business partners to say, this is worth doing for free. Because one day we might get paid.
You can have a look at it. If you want us to share, like I said, we're happy to share what we did. the needs. I mean, we shared them the other day. We've got the notes from the first meeting that we had, and then we've got the brief that we made out of that. So you can see what we did, you know, and what he liked.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again. That's great.